What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back with your favorite weekly series, the Pokemon Card Auctions of the Week Recap. Folks, in this week's recap, I have even more graded cards from the newest set, Mega Evolution, that came by. And speaking of Megas, we'll be covering a BGS 10 Black Label Japanese Mega Charizard EX that came by. Hit an unbelievable price this week. We'll be going over all of that and more, so please stay tuned till the very end. After you're done enjoying this week's auction recap, I would ask that you please go check out the 100% Pokemon card auction block happening this Sunday, August 12th on fanaticscollect.com. There, of course, you will find a variety of graded English and Japanese Pokemon cards. And up for grabs are some beautiful PSA 10 WotC cards, including a first edition Shining Charizard from Neo Destiny, and in my opinion, some very undervalued Japanese cards included in this week's auction right now. So after this recap, please go check out these cards on Fanatics ending this Sunday night. A direct link to this week's auction block will, of course, be in the description of this video. As always, I really appreciate your support. Alright, it's auction recap time. Let's start off with some graded cards from Mega Evolution. Starting off with this Mega Kangaskhan EX SIR. We saw two sales of this card as a PSA 10, one for $960, the other one for $1,075. Here we saw the Full Art Acerola's Mischief Trainer card that sold for an even $300 as a PSA 10. Here is a Mega Venusaur EX SIR that sold for $1,325. Here is my favorite card in the set, the Mega Lucario EX Special Illustration Rare that sold for $1,575, and then again for $2,175. So quite a price disparity between those two sales. Here we have a Full Art Lily's Determination that sold for $1,350. Here is the Mega Absol EX SIR that sold for $910. And then we saw two sales of this Mega Hyper Rare Lucario EX, one that sold for $3,100, the other one sold for $3,150. And then the Mega Hyper Rare Gardevoir EX sold for $3,300 this week. Up next, we saw a couple of lots of these CGC 10 Pristine Burger Chew cards. Here's a lot of 3 of them that sold for $645, and this lot of 5 here sold for $890 this week. Up next, we have a couple of insane sales from Celebrations yet again. Celebrations never fails to impress. Here is the Mew Holo that you get. Regular old Mew Holo sold this week for $685. Here is that Full Art Pikachu in PSA 10 that sold for $1,025 US. Here is the Gold Star Greninja that sold for $920 this week. And then we had a CGC 10 Pristine Metal Charizard that sold for $7,050. On to several Black Label sales. Here is a Black Label Charizard V promo from the Champions Path ETB. Sold for $1,258 this week. Here is the Korean Ditto as a Black Label. Sold for $1,875. Here we saw two PSA 10 sales of this Magikarp and Wailord GX alt art from Team Up. This one here sold for $2,750. The other one sold for $2,950. And then a Black Label sale came by and sold for $9,500. And then we saw this Black Label Lugia V from Silver Tempest that sold for a whopping $13,900 this week. Up next, we have this Black Label Gengar Art Rare. This is a Chinese exclusive card that sold for an even $10,000. And then we saw several XY era cards come by. Here is a Greninja EX Black Star promo, sold for $1,813. Here's the Mega Gengar EX, also a Black Star promo that sold for $5,820. From Flashfire, we saw this Full Art Kangaskhan EX sell for $1,325. From Ancient Origins, we have this Reverse Holo Gyarados that sold for $1,475. And then we saw all 3 of the big 3 come by from XY Evolutions, and they all sold for $1,900. On to a couple of pieces of sealed product from eBay. We have this XY base set ETB that sold for $7,357. And this can't be a real price, can it? Are these really selling for this much? Are they? We also saw this XY Phantom Forces Elite Trainer box sell for $8,357, along with the Phantom Forces booster box that sold for $12,800, and then we saw an XY Flashfire booster box sell for $9,100. And then onto the vintage portion on eBay, we have this PSA 8 Japanese no rarity symbol base set Blastoise sold for $2,861. Here is an unlimited Dark Charizard holo from Team Rocket, sold for $4,701. And I swear it was like yesterday this card was selling all day for about $1,000. This unlimited copy, now it's nearly 5 times that amount. So crazy times we're living in. Here we have an unlimited Sabrina's Gengar from Gym Heroes, sold as a PSA 10 for $8,430 US. And then several reverse holo cards from Legendary Collection came by. Here is a PSA 9 reverse holo Pikachu, sold for $2,550. A PSA 10 reverse Arcanine sold for $3,555. The Squirtle here sold for $4,746, and the Gyarados sold for $12,108. And then lastly, we saw this reverse holo Snorlax sell for $12,322. Up next, we have this double holo error Shining Gyarados in PSA 10. Which means it just has extra holofoil on it. Sold for $18,326 this week. And then several cards from the old school EX era. We have this Gyarados EX from Fire Red Leaf Green, sold for $3,150. The Gengar EX, also from Fire Red Leaf Green, sold for $13,300. And then we had the Rocket Snorlax EX sell for $9,800. And then here we saw the Ho-Oh EX from Unseen Forces that sold for $3,650 this week. A couple of Gold Star sales. Here is a PSA 9 Latias Gold Star that sold for $13,988, along with this PSA 10 Gold Star Mewtwo from EX Holon Phantoms that sold for $22,100. And then a couple of very awesome price tags on these reverse holo cards from the EX era. Here is the Lugia from Unseen Forces, sold for $3,301. Here's a reverse holo Deoxys from EX Deoxys, sold for $2,075. Here's the reverse holo Latios from Delta Species, sold for $4,500. The reverse holo Rayquaza here from Holon Phantom sold for $7,700. And then from Platinum, we saw this holo Blastoise sell for $3,307 as a PSA 10. And we also saw this reverse holo Squirtle sell as a PSA 10 for $3,050. And I'll tell you what, folks, in my opinion, Squirtle has some of the best illustrations in this entire hobby. From Diamond and Pearl Legends Awakened, we had this Rhyperior level X in PSA 10 that sold for $3,888. And then here from Heart Gold Soul Silver was this promo Pikachu holo that sold for $2,247 this week. And then from Call of Legends, we saw a PSA 10 Suicune sell for $5,600. And then a couple of notable sales from the black and white era. We had this full art Virizion from Noble Victories that sold for $1,125. A full art Shaman EX from Next Destiny sold for $3,600. Here's a full art Skyla from Boundaries Cross that sold for $3,650. And then we had this promo Deoxys EX that sold for $2,688. And then just a couple of regular holo cards that went for a pretty hefty amount. I always find those cards fascinating because nowadays people couldn't care less about holos, it seems, anymore. Here's a holo Dragonite from Dragon Vault that sold for $861, along with this Dragonite from Plasma Freeze that sold for $1,425. Here is a regular holo Latios from Dragon Vault that sold for $1,925. And then onto the Fanatics Collect Weekly Auction block, we saw several light and dark Pokemon from Neo Destiny come by. Here is a first edition Light Dragonite in PSA 10 that sold for $4,440. A Light Togetic sold for $4,560. Here's a Dark Dragonite, and this one's from Team Rocket, but it sold for $5,640. Here's a Dark Tyranitar first edition holo that sold for $5,880. Here's a beautiful first edition Dark Espeon from Neo Destiny, sold for $7,800. Here we have a reverse holo Blastoise from EX Crystal Guardians, sold for $8,100 as a PSA 10. Here's a first edition Erica's Venusaur from Gym Challenge, sold for $8,100 as well. Here's a Light Arcanine First Edition Holo that sold for $8,400. Here is a First Edition Shining Tyranitar that sold for $11,400. A First Edition Dark Gengar sold for $11,700. Remember, folks, Gengar is one of the hottest Pokemon of the year. Here's a First Edition Shining Mewtwo that sold for an even $12,000. Here's a Reverse Holo Charizard from EX Crystal Guardians that sold for $12,600. Here is a Topps Chrome Techno Dragonite in PSA 10, sold for $13,800. This is a Pop 4 card. Here's a Lugia EX from Unseen Forces, sold for $14,400. And then we saw this PSA 10 Full Art Mario Pikachu with an NBA Gold Diamond stamp on it, sold for $16,800. Along with this BGS 10 pristine copy of this card that sold for $20,400. Here we have a First Edition Pichu from Neo Genesis in PSA 10. This card always goes for an insane amount, selling this week for $19,200. Here's a First Edition Zapdos from base set in PSA 10, sold for $21,600. Here we have a BGS 9 Rayquaza Gold Star, also with the NBA Gold Diamond stamp on it, that sold for $22,200. Here's a First Edition Magneton, also from base set, that sold for $24,600. Here's a Japanese Gold Star Pikachu that sold for $25,200. Here's another base set holo. This is the First Edition Clefairy in PSA 10 that sold for $25,200. And then here we have another Japanese Gold Star card. This one is the Torchic that sold for an even $36,000. And then lastly, for our base set holos, we saw this First Edition PSA 10 Mewtwo that sold for $48,000 this week. And the auction of the week, I'm going to give to this BGS 10 Black Label Japanese Mega Charizard Special Art Rare that sold for $15,300 this week. And according to the seller, this is a confirmed paid for sale, so take that as you will. But yeah, this card is going to be an absolute monster when the English variants come out. That's all I got for you, folks. I really appreciate you watching this series each and every week. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. That's all I got today. I will catch you all on my next one.